Welcome to our training this morning that's in conjunction with the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker this morning. Sharing this morning is Jean Kapler. Jean is with the Rehabilitation Hospital of Indiana, Resource Facilitation for Brain Injury. And she's going to be speaking with us this morning on effective employment services for the LGBTQ plus community. Thank you, Jean. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve, and good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that you're joining this presentation today. This is a topic that I feel passionately about, and so I hope that you get some useful information from this morning's presentation. Some of you may have seen me present on the issues around brain injury. That's typically what I do as part of my job, but this is sort of a specialty that I developed well before I came to RHI. And so my boss has given me permission to provide this training for whoever wants it. A little bit of my background: I'm a licensed clinical social worker. Currently, I'm the local support network leader for Southern Indiana for the RHI Resource Facilitation Program. Prior to joining RHI, I had a private practice, provided counseling services, taught some classes at IU. And one of my specialties in my practice, and several of the classes that I taught at IU, were about working with the LGBTQ plus community. So I have done a lot of presentations on this topic in my previous life. So I'm happy to be able to do that now. The plan for today, this is actually part of a longer presentation, and so there will be some information on the slides that I'm going to just gloss over for today. I'm going to focus the talk a little more heavily on issues around transgender folks in an employment setting and some of the issues that can come up, some of the paperwork and documentation. We will touch on the rest of the letters in that alphabet soup, the lesbian, gay, bisexual issues. But if you want to know more, well, first, you will be able to obtain a copy of these slides later. They will be posted for you, and we'll tell you how to access those so you can see the entire presentation. At the end of the presentation, I have a lot of really good resources, and so I want you to be able to access those from this PowerPoint as well as my contact information at the end. So if you have further questions, if you would like more in-depth training for your own office or organization, please contact me and we can arrange that. Okay, and I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for some questions or comments, and hopefully we can respond to everybody. Okay, so we're going to start off talking about effective employment services for this community. And we'll do an overview of some terms and just make sure we're all on the same page before we launch into some specifics. So here I've got some common flags of the community. We're all kind of familiar with this rainbow flag up here in the upper right of your screen. That's been the traditional LGBTQ rainbow flag representing the community. But there are some parts of the community that, feel like they need kind of their own recognition, their own sub-community. So up here, you may have seen this flag. This is for the transgender community. Down here is the addition of a black and brown stripe to recognize the racial and ethnic diversity within this community, because sometimes that gets erased or ignored. And so this is just making it a little more prominent. And then down in the bottom right, we've got the bisexual flag. So if you see those symbols out there, now you know what they mean. Now, some terminology. So a term you've heard is sex, and that's typically referring to the biological differentiation between people we think of as male and female. And typically that's based on their sex chromosomes, with females having typically 2 X chromosomes and males having 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. And I put usually because that's typically how it turns out. But there are individuals that have 2 X's and a Y. I mean, there's all kinds of variability in here. And in fact, there are some species out there, particularly turtles and crocodiles, that they don't even have sex chromosomes, and their biological sex is determined based on the temperature of the eggs at incubation. So even the real basics that we think about as male and female, and well, of course, that's XX or XY, it's not always that way. Another determinant of sex is the typical anatomy of males and females. You know, our bits and pieces, what gonads do we have? What reproductive organs do we have? And then also hormonal profiles. And we think of males as having higher levels of testosterone, lower estrogen, progesterone, and women having higher levels of estrogen and progesterone and lower levels of testosterone. But even within that, there's some variability of levels of hormones, okay? But typically this is what determines sex, biological sex. Now, there's another aspect of sex and gender called gender identity. And that is one's internal sense of maleness or femaleness. And typically that falls out as, you know, someone knowing that they're a man or a woman. But there are other ways of knowing yourself in terms of gender. And some folks feel like the term genderqueer or non-binary or bigender or two-spirit or even agender, which is not having any sense of gender, fit better for their internal sense of gender. Now for me, I identify as a woman. I know myself as a woman. But until I started working with trans clients around their issues around gender, I never really thought about why I knew I was a woman. How did I know that? I mean, I know what my body says I am. I'm female. But like, what is it to feel like a woman? And so I encourage you, if you've not really given that some thought, to think about your own gender identity and how you came to know that. And for those of us who are cisgendered, which means our gender identity matches our biological sex, it all lines up, it's pretty easy and uncomplicated. It just sort of is, and maybe now we can think about why that is. But for trans folks, that's not always so clear. And so, and I will also toss in a funky little twist on this for us gay folks. Sometimes, you know, society says, you know, oh, you know, a lesbian is just, you know, thinks she's a man or something. And that's not the case. But sometimes that gender stuff gets put in there. Okay. Now, gender expression, this is another aspect we need to understand. So that's how we communicate our gender to the rest of the world. Do we have a more masculine gender expression, or a more feminine, or a more androgynous, kind of in the middle, genderqueer kind of gender expression? And so, you know, it comes down to what type of clothing do we wear in our society, where certain kinds of clothing are considered more masculine or more feminine. What ornamentation do we use, earrings and makeup and things like that. Those are all signals that are, you know, our society comes to view as more masculine or more feminine. But we also have some room to move within that. And so we have folks who identify as female, who are, you know, their biological sex has been deemed female, and yet they may have a much more masculine expression, gender expression, and maybe wear a tux and a tie to a formal event, or just in their daily presentation may have a more masculine presentation. And there's a little more room in our society for women to play with that gender expression. It's less accepted for men to have a more feminine expression, and that would be a whole nother lecture to talk about why that is. But so there's gender expression, And I put a note in here that our secondary sex characteristics also contribute to our gender expression, even though it's not voluntary. It contributes to how people read us in terms of our gender and sex. And so that comes into play for trans folks who transition using hormones, because some of those secondary sex characteristics can change. And that adds to their gender expression. Okay, another term, sexual orientation. I'm sure y'all are familiar with the idea of sexual orientation being the direction of one's attractions, but it's really based on our own sex or gender and the other person's sex or gender. So when we say someone is heterosexual, we mean that they might be a man and they are attracted to or more prone to fall in love with a woman, someone who's viewed as female. Whereas gay can be an umbrella term, including both homosexual men and women, but oftentimes it refers to gay men, because there's also a separate term, lesbians, for women who have same-sex attractions. So it's really about one's own gender or sex and who you're attracted to in terms of gender or sex. Bisexuals are folks that can be attracted to both men or women. Generally, it's talked about in those terms. I don't always like that very binary idea, but and then there's pansexual, which is a newer term, and that is typically a person who is attracted to all sorts of people, regardless of their sex or gender. And there can be other variations on pansexual, and they feel like it's really different than bisexual. Bisexual is specifically, oh, I'm attracted to both men and women. Pansexual is gender isn't really a big issue in there. That's not where the focus is. And then some folks identify as asexual, which means they really are not attracted to people romantically, and they're not looking for romantic relationships. And that's come to be a term of identification for some folks. I will say this is not an exhaustive list. I once looked up as many names for orientation as I could find, and found 25, 30 different ways of identifying. But this is at least a start, okay? So now we're used to thinking about biological sex as being either or, you're male or you're female. A lot of times if we can say, okay, that gender identity might not necessarily match up with biological sex, so let's uncouple that. We think of, well, you're either a man or you're a woman. So a trans person is either going to be a trans man or a trans woman. But what we've come to find is that none of these terms is as either or as we used to think. And so even on something we think as immutable as biological sex, there are all kinds of variations in between, the typical male and female biology. There are lots of different intersex conditions. So a person who has two X's and a Y chromosome, or a person who might be X and Y in terms of sex chromosomes. So typically that would be male, and yet their phenotype, the way their body expresses that is actually when babies are born with androgen insensitivity syndrome. The doctor looks at them, they seem to have female genitalia, and say, hey, you've got a girl. And then it's only later when the girl does not develop her period or begins, she doesn't develop breasts, she goes in for an exam, and lo and behold, she actually has XY chromosomes, but her body is insensitive to the testosterone that's being produced, so it never gets masculinized. So biological sex is not as simple as we used to think. Gender identity, there are some folks who it's very clear. For me, it's very clear I identify as a woman. There are some transgender women that it's very clear they identify as a woman. But there are some folks that, as I said, are genderqueer. They feel a little bit of both, or sometimes that changes day to day as to whether they're feeling more masculine or feminine in terms of their gender identity. And then, there are some folks that, don't have a sense of gender identity. Gender expression, we're more used to that being more of a continuum. Very hyper masculine presentations to very hyper feminine presentations, and kind of everything in between. And then sexual orientation, we got that, okay, so there can be heterosexual and homosexual, that old Kinsey scale that you may have heard of, and with bisexuality somewhere in the middle. So let's think of all of these as a continuum. And for most folks, everything lines up at one end of that continuum easily in an uncomplicated manner. So you might be a biological male who identifies as a man with at least somewhat masculine gender expression. And oftentimes these guys are attracted to women, but it doesn't always end up that way. All right. And that's where things can start to get complicated in living in society, because we have all kinds of beliefs lined up about how all of these things should align. All right. So now let's talk about some transgender issues. And as I said, I'm going to spend a little more time focusing here. So I have some pictures of some folks that are out trans folks in the public vision. And so many of you have heard of Laverne Cox down in the bottom left-hand corner. She's a pretty well-known actress. She was on Orange is the New Black. She's been in a couple of other TV spots. She's also just a fantastic public speaker and advocate for trans rights. I've seen her speak up here at IU, and she's just phenomenal. So she is a transgender woman. She was assigned male at birth and during her life transition, and is now able to express her female self. Chaz Bono, you may have heard, is the child of Sonny and Cher Bono. And he transitioned a number of years ago, came out as trans, and is now living his life as an out trans man. He also is a really good public speaker, and he was on Dancing with the Stars a few years ago. You might have seen him. And then Jazz Jennings has a TV show about her life. I first ran into Jazz when she was maybe 9, and she was producing some YouTube videos, she and her family, because in her family, she was very accepted at a very early age as she came out as trans. And kids, studies show that children develop express their sense of gender identity very early on, and that's laid down very early in our development. And so when little kids say, "No, mommy, I'm a girl," when their parents thought they had a boy, those kids aren't typically just being confused. And so in Jazz's family, she could come out and was accepted very early on, and has been living her life as a trans girl. All right, I should say young woman now. So some language. I've used a few of these terms. So transgender are folks whose gender identity doesn't match up their sex that was assigned at birth. And cisgender, we needed some word for the folks whose gender identity does match their sex assigned at birth. So I identify as a cisgender woman. And So most folks fall into that cisgender. That actually comes from chemistry, trans and cis molecules. So I don't know, somebody adapted it for this language. Non-binary or genderqueer. Sometimes you'll hear gender nonconforming. So non-binary just means that gender identity is a little more fluid. It doesn't quite match typically male or female gender identities. Same thing for genderqueer, or just somebody that wants to, get past that kind of gender binary. In general, for language, we want to use for trans folks their preferred pronouns and chosen name. So you may have noticed at the beginning of my slides presentation, I had my name and my credentials, and then I put she, her, hers for pronouns. And in general, that signals, hey, this is a safe place for some variability in gender pronouns. So using a person's preferred pronouns and chosen name, I say don't dead name them. That's a term that's used within the trans community for people using the name that was assigned to them at birth by their parents. And now that, if a person is out and has chosen a different name that fits them better, using that old name sometimes can be a mistake, but sometimes that's used to hurt people too. And then using the language a person prefers, even about identity. So when I was in practice, I had some clients that identified as transgender, and they felt really comfortable with that term. I had a client who did not like that term because in the past it's been used as kind of an umbrella term that included all kinds of gender expressions that weren't always about gender identity and biological sex not matching up. So she preferred transsexual. Other people aren't comfortable with that term. Some folks prefer genderqueer. I just always ask my clients, when we'd have these conversations, what terms do you prefer? What pronouns do you prefer? So, because you don't always know. Now, a little bit about pronouns, because this comes up a lot. First of all, it's really important. It's a sign of respect. It's a sign of saying, I see you, I believe you when you tell me what your gender identity is, and I respect that. So use the pronouns requested. Now, there are some folks that may identify as genderqueer, and really, so he and him and his, or she and her and hers, does not feel comfortable for them. It doesn't fit them because their sense of gender is not just male or just female. They oftentimes, not always, oftentimes prefer they, them, and theirs. All right. But this is something that I've heard lots of folks, especially lots of cis folks and even some other trans folks, get hung up on. Because, if you happen to have been an English major, like some folks, they, these are plural pronouns. We don't use those to refer to a single person, but actually we do when we have situations where we don't know the gender of the person we're talking about. So we say things like, nobody in their right mind would do that. When we're really talking about no one person in his or her right mind would do that, but we say their right mind. Or we need someone in this job who's flexible in their approach. Not, it's kind of a shortcut. We need someone who is flexible in his or her approach. If we want to be really gender inclusive, we would also recognize that there could be some genderqueer people that apply for this job. So there is a comfortable way to express that. If anyone wants a refund, they can request it at the office. So we use these terms automatically when we are trying to not be gender specific. And so let's use those terms, for those pronouns, for folks whose gender identity is not gender specific. Okay, it can take some getting used to, and I will tell you that if you're working with someone that maybe you knew them prior to their coming out and transitioning, and you got to used to using certain pronouns in a certain name, that sometimes you're going to make mistakes, and that's not the end of the world. You just say, oh, I'm sorry, and correct yourself. And a lot of trans folks are really used to it. While it gets old after a while, people can tell the difference between an honest mistake that you're willing to correct and on purpose using the wrong name or wrong pronoun because you don't respect them. Okay. So transitioning, we talk about transitioning for trans people, and we can think of it in a couple of different ways. So there's social transitioning. There's what am I saying to you about myself, and I'm letting you know this information about myself. And I'm asking you to now understand me with this new name, and that actually you thought I was this gender, but really I'm that gender. And so, you know, it's making yourself known in the world. It's maybe changing up your gender expression to more closely align with your sense of gender and moving out into the world. It's dealing with family around these issues, dealing with your parents as you change your name from the name they gave you, which can be very special and meaningful for them, to this new chosen name. And how do you negotiate that with them? So there's all of that, and that can happen whether or not you medically transition. Medical transition is the inclusion of hormones and hormone blockers, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. It's inclusion for some folks of gender confirmation surgeries, whether that be top surgery, addressing removal of mammary glands, or potentially surgery to create breasts. There are other supplemental surgeries that some folks do. There are other services such as laser hair removal, might be restoration of hairline, if some male pattern baldness has kicked in already. So there are lots of different ways to alter the body. Now, note on hormones and hormone blockers. For a lot of trans folks, especially older ones, they may not have come out even to themselves as trans until they had already gone through puberty. Or maybe they knew they were trans even at age 2 or 3, even if they didn't have words for it, but they didn't think there was anything to do about it, and it wasn't safe. And so they just are like, well, I just have to live with this. And so their bodies went through puberty and became masculinized or feminized. They got these secondary sex characteristics. And now they can take hormones and get some real changes in their body. For a person who was assigned male at birth, who takes estrogens, female hormones, they may get some actual breast growth. Their pore size will change from larger pore sizes to smaller pore size, so their skin becomes smoother looking. Fat distributions in the body can change. Same thing for taking testosterone. You know, your voice will deepen, your vocal cords lengthen, and that's a change that does not reverse if a person stops taking testosterone. They may get more facial hair growth. If there's male pattern baldness that runs in their family, they will start developing that. There will be fat redistribution in the body, and their pores in their skin start to get a little larger. And I mentioned that because, you know, pore size actually is surprisingly effective at conveying gender. It's a really subtle change, but it goes a long way for how people read you, actually, surprisingly. So that's all if your body has already gone through puberty. But for kids that come out before puberty hits and their families are accepting and they're affirming of their gender, there are options to take hormone blockers and prevent, all that does is prevent puberty from hitting. So their body doesn't get masculinized or feminized depending on what hormones are going to be released during puberty. That buys some time, so that then later the appropriate hormones can be introduced that can either masculinize or feminize the body to more closely align with that person's identified gender. And so that was the case for Jazz Jennings. And so that transition is a little easier, and the body just conforms more closely with that person's actual gender identity. Okay, so now I will say not everybody transitions medically because, number one, there's money involved in that. Sometimes insurance will pay, oftentimes it'll pay for hormones, possibly hormone blockers. Some insurances will pay for gender confirmation surgeries, some do not, and it's really expensive. And especially for trans men getting genital surgeries, that's more expensive than for trans women to get genital surgeries. And it oftentimes the results are not as successful. So many trans guys do not opt for that bottom surgery. Some do. But my point is not everybody can access all those surgeries. Even laser hair removal can be expensive. And some people cannot socially transition even. They know they're trans or they know they're genderqueer, but there's just no way to be out about that in their community because it does not feel safe, or because the family dynamics are such that it's just going to be too difficult or even dangerous. Trans kids comprise one of the higher percentages of homeless youth. Trans and LGBT kids are overrepresented in our homeless youth. So, you know, there can be abuse, there can be just a lot of it can be dangerous. Same thing within school systems. So, but some do, and some successfully live out loud. So, and then thinking about implications for the job. People may not, I mean, I've known folks who have lost their jobs when they came out as trans and wanted to present honestly and authentically. So that's an issue that then really hits for all you BR counselors and employment consultants out there. So, okay, transitioning on the job. There are all kinds of issues. So you might have a person who's already transitioned. Let's say they've, you know, transitioned years ago, and this is just who they are. There still can be some issues on the job. They go in for that job interview. They don't have to come out as trans, but when they're filling out paperwork with HR, depending on how much of their documentation has changed and filling out forms for health insurance, it can get complicated even for a person who transitioned years ago. But if someone is newer at this, is newer in the process, or is getting a job and transitions, or they're on the job, maybe you're working with them around a disability, but now they want to come out and transition. There are all kinds of issues around the timing of that, who to talk to about it, what to ask for from your employer to help that transition go successfully with your coworkers. You know, how do you communicate that with folks? You know, some folks ask that their boss or the head of their company just send out an email to everybody and say, hey, you know, everyone that you've known, you know, this person you've known as John Smith is actually, you know, Karen Smith. And so she's transitioning and this is what we expect. Some people are comfortable with that. Some people want to, you know, talk to folks one-on-one. So it really needs to, what happens needs to be directed by the person who's transitioning. And if you are an employment consultant, your role is to help them think through how they want to deal with that with their employer, what they want to do, what are their concerns about it, what could be some potential negative fallout, what could be some potential positive things that come out of it, and then help them to advocate for themselves around transitioning. Document changes. When a person transitions, there are all kinds of decisions to be made, even, you know, what name feels better for me. And that is such a personal decision. But then once that decision is made, how do we get all my documents, my driver's license, my utility bills, my, the name on my lease, or, how do I get all of this changed? And then how do I get all my documents to match up? And we're going to talk about some of that here pretty soon, because you may be a support for a person to get that done. They may need information on how to do it. And so I want you to understand that. And then being able to help a person address any resistance or pushback they may get. Sometimes that resistance turns into harassment on the job, people deliberately using the wrong name, or using the wrong pronouns, or, sometimes worse things than that, really disparaging remarks, sabotaging of their work, etc., all the way to out and out discrimination, firing, refusing to promote people, or refusing to hire people. And for a lot of years, that was perfectly legal, and we'll talk about that. There have been some major changes. If you've seen this talk that I'm doing before, we've got a major update on some of this. And then inappropriate application of dress codes for what's appropriate dress for men versus women, and bathrooms. Bathrooms. A lot of trans folks will tell you that bathrooms are the bane of their existence, because everybody needs to pee. Oftentimes that happens while you're at work, but people can get wigged out about trans folks. Cis people can get wigged out about trans folks using the bathroom that, it fits their gender identity. And it can actually be even a dangerous issue for transgender folks to use the appropriate bathroom that matches their gender identity. So trans women going into women's restrooms, trans guys going into men's restrooms. Restroom usage really needs to be a choice for the trans person. So I know a trans guy who is not medically transitioning, but has a very masculine gender presentation, but people are kind of all over the map as to how they read him. And he chooses to use the women's restroom because it feels safer for him. But he was actually accosted. He was at a lodge one time having lunch, and went into the women's restroom, and some cisgender man, I'm assuming, came in that women's restroom after him and was really aggressive about, what are you doing in the women's room? Thinking that because he read my friend as male, which is his gender identity. But my friend is like, whoa, and I mean, it was a very tense and threatening situation. But if he walks into a men's restroom, he doesn't know how he's going to be read there either. So, and we'll talk a little bit about, reviewing your own policies around bathrooms, but it may be something you need to support a person in negotiating with their employer, and because sometimes harassment really comes up around that. Okay, there are a whole lot of myths about trans folks, that every transgender person seeks hormones and surgery, and as we said, that's not always the case. The other thing is that if someone was born and assigned male at birth, but they really identify as female and they transition, most folks assume that that transgender woman is supposed to be attracted to men, because we also assume heterosexuality. So fine, if you're a woman, then of course you're attracted to men. Sometimes that's the case, but sometimes not. Which really goes to show that gender identity and sexual orientation are two separate aspects of ourselves. So whatever your gender identity, then let's figure out, who are you attracted to in terms of their gender and sex. And, so there are some trans women that are attracted to other women and identify as lesbian. There are some trans guys, many may be attracted to women, but there are some trans guys that are attracted to men. So they're gay men, gay trans men. Some trans guys are attracted to both, so they're bisexual, or some might be pansexual trans guys. The other idea is that if you're trans, you are either male or female, and you're going to be kind of hyper masculine or hyper feminine, both in terms of your gender presentation, but also your behaviors. So, I had a trans woman client who was struggling with the fact that she still really liked to go fishing, but she was raised that fishing was more of a guy's activity, in her family. And, we know that men and women all go fishing, but for her that was a little bit, that challenging her gender. The other idea is that under that LGBTQ plus umbrella, that everybody all gets along with each other and respects each other. There are transgender folks who are actually kind of homophobic or biphobic or even transphobic. And the same goes for the LG and B sub-communities. There are some gay people that are very transphobic. There are some gay people that are very biphobic and don't believe that bisexuality is a real thing. So it's all over the map. And then the most damaging one is that transgender folks are sexual predators or hypersexual somehow. That is part of what underlies all the uproar about bathrooms, that some trans woman is going to go in the bathroom and accost other cis women in the bathroom. Or that, they're child predators in some way. And the statistics simply do not bear that out. So I'm just gonna, that's not true. Okay, so some do's and don'ts. I will say that those stereotypes and myths will come up in the workplace too, amongst coworkers. So you need to be aware of those things. Real quickly, it's not okay to ask if someone has had the surgery. First of all, because there's not just the surgery, there can be multiple surgeries. But you're basically asking what the status of their genitals is. And that's not okay. I don't want anyone to ask me the status of my genitals, and I'm sure you don't either. So that's not okay to ask. And it's also not relevant. It's not relevant to this person's moving through the world. Nobody's going to be, looking to see if they've had surgery or not. That's not the most important part of them, and it doesn't define whether they're really a woman or really a man. Okay. Obviously, don't use the wrong pronouns. Do your best on that. This is a strange one. Complimenting them on how well they passed. Like, I never would have guessed that you were born whatever. That actually can come across really wrong and uncomfortable. It makes a person feel like you're sizing them up. And are they doing this well enough? And so even though that may be a genuine thing that you might notice in yourself, oh, wow, I'm surprised to find that this person has just come out to me as trans. I never would have guessed. That's a normal human reaction, but verbalizing that to another person sets up a different dynamic. As I said, don't make assumptions about their orientation or ask what their, quote, real name is. Their real name is the name that they've chosen. There are offensive terms, and people will jokingly use this offensive term of tranny. Don't do that. It's not okay. I feel uncomfortable even including it in this slide. And don't out them to other people. This is their own personal information. Lots of things that you can do to help. Asking if they have any concerns about working, like they're doing a job search. Do they have concerns about that? Or they're going to go for an interview. Do they have any concerns? Do they need to know more information about the employer? Because that says to them that you're thinking about these things too, and you're on their side and want to make it a safe experience for them. And, examining ourselves for any negative biases we hold. We have been raised in a world that says there are men and women, and that's unchangeable, and men and women are attracted to the opposite sex, and that's unchangeable, and that sinks into ourselves. it's normal for us to have some points of discomfort, maybe some negative stereotypes, but we need to uncover that in ourselves and do our own work around that so that we don't accidentally hurt the folks that we're working with, or our coworkers or our neighbors. Okay, so we all need to, just take an honest look at that, and then also be aware that outside events may be affecting them. In Indiana, we've had bathroom bills come up that would make Chaz Bono use the women's restroom when he was in Indiana. We've had, at the federal level, there's a rule that transgender people now are not allowed to serve in the military. There are reversals of protections in healthcare that have happened so that now trans folks don't have those protections in healthcare anymore. And so those things affect people in their daily lives, and it stresses them out. And it's helpful for the supportive people in their life, including their job coach or their VR counselor, to be aware and, just check in for you. How are you doing? I know there's this, bathroom bill going on. Are you doing okay? That's all right to ask, and it actually can be very welcomed. Okay, let's see. I've got 25 minutes left. All right, I'm going to touch on some sexual orientation issues. I've included here Ellen as an out lesbian, Cynthia Nixon, who played on Sex and the City and some other films and such, and actually ran for, I think she ran for governor of New York. She's an out bisexual. And RuPaul Charles, I included RuPaul because he is a gay man. He identifies as a cisgender gay man who does drag as a performance, and he is really good as a drag performer. You might know him from RuPaul's Drag Race. And he had a recent series, I think on Netflix or Hulu. And so he's really good at doing drag, but he identifies as a gay man. All right, so I'm going to touch on this. There's been a lot of progress for gay, lesbian, bisexual folks. Marriage equality became the law of the land in 2015. In Indiana, we had a court case that said that Indiana had to start marrying same-sex couples and had to start recognizing the marriages that were performed previously out of state, because before you could go to a state that would marry gay couples, but when you came back to Indiana, your marriage license effectively disappeared. And so Indiana had a court case that happened in 2014. That's actually when my wife and I got married, during that little window in the summer of 2014. But then our marriage was kind of, we weren't sure if the state recognized us when that decision was on hold for a little while. But then the following summer, there was a Supreme Court decision, and so now same-sex couples can get married just like opposite-sex couples. In general, sexual orientation diversity is a little better accepted in society, but there is still discrimination. There is still negative attitudes, and people that think that gay people should be served with a death sentence. That's still out there. There are still families that reject folks, but in general, this is much more accepted in our society now. There are a lot of myths, and I'll let you look those over, and they align a lot with trans folks' myths. There's some do's and don'ts. Just real quickly, you all know not to ask who's the man and who's the woman in a relationship, because that doesn't work. Don't out folks. Again, examine yourself for any negative biases you hold. And I will say us gay folks can also have negative biases about gay people too, even about ourselves. And that's a lifelong, process of examining that and challenging it and educating ourselves. And again, outside events can affect them. Okay, so let's talk briefly about living in the world, and then we'll talk a little more about employment issues. So coming out is really a lifelong process for lots of folks. For trans folks, there may be a coming out process as they're transitioning. Once they've transitioned, they may not choose to come out and let folks know that they're trans, and that's okay too. For gay folks, it's a choice for many folks to come out. I don't know that I am automatically recognizable as a lesbian when I'm out walking around in the world, but I also know, I mean, I started coming out when I was in my 20s, and I guess I just came out to all of you on this webinar by referencing marrying my wife and, you know, whatever. So it really is a lifelong process. It happens all the time. I can't even remember who I'm out to and who I'm not. Managing coming out on the job, now that's where things get really interesting and where you might come in as a support. So it's about dealing with coworkers and supervisors and clients and customers too. And helping folks figure out how they're going to deal with any negative responses and how they're going to keep their own mental health and wellness stable in the face sometimes of, you know, harassment and pushback. But it also, it helps a person's mental health to be able to be out if they choose to be out, if they want to be out. It takes so much energy to stay in the closet and maintain that. When you're talking with your coworkers about what you did over the weekend and you just spent the whole weekend with your spouse, but like you know, it's hard to keep up the closet. It takes a toll on people. And then dealing with just personal life, you know, their housing, renting. Early on when I came to Indiana and was looking for housing for myself and my then partner, my first partner and I had a commitment ceremony. It wasn't legal to get married. I was wearing a wedding ring, but I found the perfect house for us. And I didn't know that landlord. And I took off my wedding ring and talked about me and my roommate. And it did not feel good at all. But you know, those are choices that folks sometimes have to make early on, or you know, it's a little more acceptable now, so I might make a different choice. I know I would make a different choice at this point. But you know, coming out to social circles, volunteering in places, dealing with medical settings and doctors, and you know, and then, you know, what if down the road you're recuperating from surgery, need to go to a nursing home, or you reach a point in your life where you need that nursing home level of care or in-home care, you know, and folks are going to be bathing you, folks, I mean, you know, this comes up in every aspect of life. Ultimately, respecting a person's right to disclose or not, okay? Coming out on the job. 46% of LGBTQ workers in the US are closeted at work. And this was as of a couple of studies in 2019. 59, so the vast majority, almost 60% of non-LGBTQ folks believe it's unprofessional for someone to discuss sexual orientation or gender identity in the workplace. So does that mean it's unprofessional to talk about your same-sex partner, or talk about, you know, what's happening in the news around an assault on rights, when that is just, you know, part of your life? So intersectionality between disability and sexual orientation, gender identity. Now, there are lots of points of intersection around sexual orientation, gender identity, and race or religion. But specifically, we're going to talk about disability. Folks with disabilities are often seen as non-sexual, especially if they have intellectual disabilities. But across the board, this happens. When we know that folks with disabilities do have a sexual life and sexual feelings, romantic feelings. And oftentimes, folks with intellectual disabilities are assumed not to be able to understand their own sexual orientation or gender identity, and that is simply not true. So I think we need to just recognize that that's a misconception. And we have to remember that the non-disabled LGBTQ plus community may have stereotypes about people with disabilities, just like the straight non-disabled community. And folks with disabilities may have an anti-LGBTQ feelings as well, just like folks without disabilities. So there are a lot, so it's like, where do I find community where I fit in for all of me? And so you, as an employment consultant or a VR counselor, you know that people feeling supported and finding community helps them be in a better state of mind for work and stability. And so you need to be aware that sometimes this can be challenging for folks with disabilities who also are a sexual or gender minority. Okay, documentation. Now, I put up the stuff for changing the driver's license because that's pretty straightforward to do. And I'm going to talk about some other aspects of documentation. So in Indiana, for now, because this keeps changing, but for now, to change your gender marker on your driver's license to an F, an M, and I think last time I heard, X is still an option, but there was an effort in the legislature to make that not be an option. I recently checked with BMB, and you can still get an X for now. You can either bring in, if a person has amended their gender marker on their birth certificate, they can just bring that in and the BMB is supposed to change their gender marker. Or you can get a form filled out. It's listed on the BMB website, and I've included the website here where you can get all that information. There's a form that you can take to a doctor and have them fill it out, stating that this person has completed all medical procedures to permanently change their gender. Now, that it doesn't specify what medical procedures need to have been done. If you're taking hormones, there are some changes that are permanent. And there are many doctors that will feel comfortable filling this out for that. For someone just taking hormones with no surgeries on the horizon. That's not the same as every other state. There are other states that have different rules about this, but in Indiana, that form is needed, or a physician can, on their own letterhead, state that same statement from that form off the website and just put that on their letterhead. And a person's supposed to be able to take that to the BMB. That is not guaranteeing that the BMB, that the frontline worker is going to understand all of this. And so you might have to talk to a supervisor, and you might even have to talk to the supervisor's supervisor. But the word is getting out more as they train their staff around these procedures, so that hopefully this goes much more smoothly than it did in the beginning. Now, I am going to stop sharing this and go to sharing the document that should be available to you. I don't know if it was sent out or if you can access it through a website. Steve will talk to you about that at the end. But everyone should get a copy of this name and gender marker change. Steve, can you see that on my screen? Or Jackie?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure that went successful. Okay, so we just talked about changing the gender marker on your driver's license. Now, for changing your name on your driver's license, you have to change your name legally. So we're going to start with that, name change. In Indiana, you can file a petition with the court. Just go down to the county clerk's office and file a petition to change your name. Lots of folks change their names for lots of reasons. Typically, then you would take that notice of that petition to change your name, get a copy of that, and take it to a newspaper and run that in the paper once per week for 3 weeks. And you have to pay to run that. And then the last publication of that notice in the paper has to be at least 30 days before your court hearing to finally change your name. So it takes a little while to do this. But that also, if you're changing your name because you got married and you didn't change it at the time, and now you got to go through this process, that's no big deal. You run it in the paper, okay, you change your name. But if you're changing your name from John Smith to Karen Smith, it outs you to your whole community, to anyone who reads that paper, and that can be dangerous. Trans folks are one of the most likely groups to experience hate crimes and assaults and murders, especially trans folks of color, but trans folks in general. So that can be dangerous. So now we have an option to keep that process confidential. It's asking for a Rule 9 hearing, and then the judge right then can say, okay, we're waiving that demand that you publish this in the paper, and we're going to keep your final court hearing closed. All right. Judges often will ask for, that's the next section. Okay, so once that name change is approved by the judge, and it should be straightforward, they just want to make sure that you're not like changing your name for nefarious reasons, like to duck out on bill collectors or something. Or for some sort of corruption. All right, so once that happens, the name is changed, the court sends that decree to the State Department of Health and the local county health department. And then you can take that decree and share it with your employers, the BMB, Social Security office, to get your name changed on all of those forms and changed within your employer. Keep in mind, there's a $157 fee for filing this. There can be some financial help with that. The person should check with the office when they go in to file the forms. And then there are some trans groups that help people pay for that. Okay, now changing the gender marker on the birth certificate. Surprisingly, it's become easier in Indiana to do that than in a lot of states. Next door in Illinois, their law is that you have to have gender confirmation surgery, genital surgeries, to be able to change your gender marker, and a doctor has to attest that you had that genital surgery. Again, most people don't get that because it's expensive, it's major surgery. There can be loss of some functions and complications, so a lot of folks don't do it. In Indiana, though, you have to file a petition to change your gender marker with the court. So it's the same process. You started out the same way. Now the court will hear the case, and oftentimes the judge will ask for a letter from the doctor kind of showing that, yes, this person is transitioning, but you don't have to supply any of the specifics about that. So the court hears the case and then can issue an order to change that gender marker on the birth certificate. You can keep this process confidential. Again, it doesn't have to be a public hearing. And then you can take that decree to the Department of Health that issued your birth certificate, all right? So if you've moved within Indiana, you need to take it to that county where you were born, and they will issue a new birth certificate with the appropriate gender marker. And then now you've got your birth certificate changed. You can take it to the BMB if you haven't, already changed your gender marker through those other options. You can take it to your employer, all of that. Now, and I included guides for the process in Indiana, okay? So you can give all this information to a client you're working with who's maybe thinking their way through this. You can help them look up the information. Caution, this information could change over time with various updates, but this is the way it is as of about a month and a half ago. So, all right, let's see, stop sharing screen, and let's get back to my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, I'm assuming y'all can see my PowerPoint again. So
yeah, that's correct.
Thank you. So that's a whole lot of detail on how to navigate name changes and gender marker changes on documents. Even if you get all that done, just heads up, this does cause complications for health insurance, because health insurance wants to know, are you a male or a female? And then there are certain procedures that are allowed only for males and certain procedures that are allowed only for females. And so if you're a trans guy and you change your gender marker to M on your birth certificate, and you change that with your health insurance company, but you still have your uterus and ovaries, you still need to get gynecological exams to guard for cancer and such. And if you're in the insurance system as a male, they're gonna reject that claim for a gynecological exam. And insurance companies still have not caught up with the complexities around this. This even comes up for folks going for medical procedures that should not have anything to do with being a man or a woman. An anesthesiology charge. I mean, I've seen real life experiences where people have spent hours appealing and going round and round with their insurance company and their doctors and how they're filing things because some claim got denied because of gender. So we have a long way to go on that. And so it's good to talk with the client, with the HR person, and figure out what's the best way to manage the insurance gender thing, so that the person can get medical care they need. Okay. Let's see. Why am I not being able to advance my slide? There we go. Okay. Now, laws. This is an important update. As of this summer, on June 15th, the Supreme Court ruled that discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation is now considered illegal under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. That was the baseline Civil Rights Act. We've since expanded that to include discrimination based on disability, pregnancy status, etc. But sexual orientation and gender identity were not explicitly listed back then. But the Supreme Court heard a case. There were actually 3 cases that had rulings in lower courts, and they made their way to the Supreme Court. One was of a transgender woman named Amy Stevens. She was fired. She'd been a funeral director for like 7 years at this company. She was fired when she came out to her boss and said, hey, I'm actually a woman and I want to begin presenting as a woman in my job. She got fired solely for that reason. There were 2 gay men that were fired. One was a child welfare coordinator for Clayton County, Georgia. And he got fired when his bosses found out he joined a gay softball league. He was fired for being gay. Then another gay man, he was a skydiving instructor, and he was fired when his boss found out he was gay. So they sued, and there have been lots of different rulings around this. A lot of rulings come down that, and in fact, a lot of these rulings were like, no, it's not included. It's perfectly legal. And so we had a situation for years. There was no federal law forbidding discrimination in employment, housing, or public accommodations like going to a restaurant, etc. We had 21 states in the District of Columbia, plus a couple of territories, that banned employment discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity, and one that only banned it based on sexual orientation. In Indiana, we had a hodgepodge of counties and cities and city counties that banned discrimination based on sexual orientation and or gender identity. There were a few that only banned sexual orientation discrimination, and it only covered folks that lived in those jurisdictions. And it was variable in terms of what kinds of consequences could happen for discriminating in employment. Now, because of the Supreme Court ruling that was 6-3, saying, look, you know, in fact, in the decision, they said that it's impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating based on sex, because you're saying, okay, men who want to date other men can be fired, whereas if a woman wants to date a man, she's not fired. And so it's all based on gender. Or a woman who wants to wear dresses to work and be known as a woman, she is fine. People that we see, a cisgender woman, but a transgender woman who wants to do the same thing, she's going to be fired. So now, I mean, that's a huge relief, knowing that there are employment protections. I know people who have been fired for these reasons. And so now, you know, before you could make a complaint and the EEOC would say, well, I'm sorry, it's legal in your state. So now it's not. That's huge. So your clients are now protected in employment. So, all right, we're almost out of time. There's a lot of discrimination and harassment that takes place. You can look at the statistics. This really, you know, gay people, trans folks, everybody experiences this to one degree or another. This turns into, it creates a lot of stress that increases lots of physical issues, like increased risk of heart disease and stroke and high blood pressure, depression, anxiety, increased risk of suicide. 41% of transgender people have actually attempted suicide versus 1.6% of cisgender people. That is appalling. Life expectancy is affected. Gay and lesbian people live 12 years longer on average in communities that are very gay friendly compared to communities that are not gay friendly. 12 years, controlling for all other risk factors. I'm going to skip Vivian's story. If you want to know, you can send me an email and I'll tell you Vivian's story. What you can do. Understanding these barriers is huge, and being aware of what's going on in the news is huge. The baseline is being respectful and offering support and assistance. That goes so far. You can trip up on pronouns and say, oh, I'm sorry. You know, you can say, I'm not an expert on all of this, but if you are moving from a place of respect and support, that goes miles for folks that often feel very unsupported and feel even like their own governments are targeting them. Walking into a new workplace is like, gee, I hope everybody's okay. So it goes a really long way. Important for employment consultants to obviously be affirming, but being aware of these issues on the job, knowing what the atmosphere is in a potential employment site. Do they even have non-discrimination policies in place for themselves? I mean, now it's the law of the land, but you know, a lot of places also have their own non-discrimination policies that include certain things. Are gay and LGBTQ folks covered under those? I've included a lot of resources that look at inclusivity of health insurance plans nationally, that look at employment, like big employers that are very LGBTQ friendly. So I want you to check those out. Benefits are the same for married spouses, whether they're same-sex or opposite-sex couples. And for voc rehab, it's really important for a person to know that if they're having a problem with any one of the vendors that you might authorize to work with them, that they can come to you and talk to you about, you know, I'm not sure if this person's okay with trans folks, and, you know, have you helped them navigate that. Okay, paperwork versus interaction. In your paperwork that you have to fill out with folks, especially if they haven't legally changed their names or gender or whatever, you may have to talk about that with them and say, okay, so technically we have to put down your legal name in our paperwork, but I will address you by your preferred name, okay? And looking at your own policies in your own agency and office space, if you have folks check what gender they are, is it just male or female, or do you give other options? What are your policies around restroom use, and what do you do to make sure it's going to be safe for everyone? Are all staff aware of these considerations? Do all staff use the person's preferred name at all times, and do they understand they need to? So, you know, looking at your own agency and what you can do to become more affirming. And I've also included some guides around that in the ending slides. And plus, addressing employer concerns. They're like, I want to be supportive, but you know, if they're out waiting tables and then they change their, you know, gender expression as they're doing that, how do we navigate, you know, customer response? So you need to be able to talk with them about that. That doesn't mean you have to be the expert, but I've included guides specifically for employers. But you can also, you know, play up, what does this person bring to this job? And remember that sometimes employment sites navigating this as a staff, you know, actually helps the whole employment site become more cohesive. It can actually be a positive in a place. So asking yourself some questions, self-education, and I've included a lot of, if in all your spare time out there, you can check out some of these websites and just poke around and read, and you will learn so much from doing that. The HRC is a Workplace Divided. It has a lot of good information about this stuff. I want to point out this resource, a toolkit for employers, version 10. That's a really good toolkit that you can show employers for how to navigate this. There's also one for HR professionals. So check these resources out. There are resources for finding trans affirming insurance and affirming employers and communities. There's a guide specifically for trans folks and non-binary folks for how to do a job search. The national listing of LGBT chambers of commerce, there's one in Indianapolis. If a business is a member of that, they're probably affirming. Okay. Now, it is 10:19, so we've got 11 minutes for questions and comments. I'm going to stop sharing this. And Steve, I think you were sending me a document with the list of questions and comments.
Yes, they can, if you have a few minutes right now, and you want to ask a question, you can unmute your mic and ask the question, or if you prefer not to speak, you can type in your question in the chat feed, and I'll get those questions to Jean. We can try to answer a few of those that come in first while we have time. And if we don't get to your question, Jean can answer them in an FAQ, which we can provide later. So if you have a question, type it in or unmute your mic and ask your question now. Question about the PowerPoint. Yes, it will be shared.
Yep. And I will also toss out that if you want a more in-depth training, I glossed over some of this stuff. So more in-depth training and conversation with your own organization or your own VR area office, let me know, and I'm happy to arrange a time to do that with you all, okay?
Yeah, and the PowerPoint, the recording of this video and the other resources will be posted on IIDC's website for non-VR staff, and for VR staff, it will be posted on the VR SharePoint site.
Jean,
So,
oh.
no, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Jackie. I have a question for you.
Mhm.
Um, that whole thing about insurance really bothers me. Is there any kind of movement or activity towards insurance companies investigating and how they can change their policies?
There are transgender rights advocacy organizations that are really pushing on this. They're pushing for Medicare to navigate these issues better, because oftentimes the policies adopted by Medicare tend to be adopted by commercial insurances eventually. But yes, there are lots of efforts to try to advocate for transgender affirming and inclusive policies within insurance policies. It should not be a big deal to have a person sign up as trans, and so that, you know, if this is a trans guy, you know, there's an automatic override that, of course, he can get gynecological exams. There's also, you know, so there's insurance and what it will cover. And they should cover hormones and surgical interventions. Excuse me. But you know, back when I was in private practice, they didn't even cover psychotherapy if the reason I was seeing the person was to navigate these gender issues. I had to put down a diagnosis of depression or adjustment disorder or anxiety, and diagnose someone with a mental health condition to get insurance coverage for counseling. And now that has changed, but we still have a long ways to go. Yes, I see someone says that United Healthcare and Anthem will cover these, and it's a hodgepodge. There are some insurances that are actually really good. Employers also have some say in when they contract with an insurance company to provide coverage. They can say, yeah, we want this covered. So sometimes it's about advocating at the employer level, as long as we have employer-based insurance. Clarify the terms trans, non-binary, gender fluid. Okay, so transgender is when your gender identity doesn't match up with that biological sex, whereas cisgender is when it does. But there's variabilities. Sometimes transgender specifically just doesn't feel right for some folks who will say, you know, no, I don't feel like, yeah, I was assigned female at birth, but my gender identity is male. I maybe was assigned female at birth, but my gender identity is, you know, somewhere in the middle between, it's not clearly male or female. Or bigendered, sometimes people will use that term to say, my gender oftentimes feels very male, and I want to express as male in the world, but there are other times when it feels very female. And I don't know why it goes back and forth like that, but that's my experience. And so bigender it fits me. Gender queer is like, you know, forget gender. You know, it's not about gender. I just want to be me, and I'm not gonna, you know, claim male or female. That is some gender queer person's experience. Other people might say, no, it's more fluid for me, so I'm gonna claim gender queer. So even the terms themselves can be used a little differently depending on the person. Um, I figure, you know, it keeps life more interesting, and let's just go with that. Two-spirit is a term that comes from some Native American communities that understood uh, issues around gender and gender variability, and were very accepting of that, and so they describe that as being two-spirit. Okay, and I'm just checking the chat box for a few other things. Virtual support group for high school students who are trans. Um, uh, so there are some really cool things going on in southern Indiana, down around the Evansville area. And I don't know if they're holding their groups virtually right now. I think at least one of them may be. And I will try to get that information, and we'll post that on the website. I know in the Bloomington area and surrounding counties around Monroe County, there's the PRISM youth community that is really trans affirming, gay, lesbian, bi affirming, and they are meeting virtually as well. So if you want, when I get done with all of this, I'll find all the groups that I can, youth focused groups, and post some links. And Jackie, can I send that to you and then you'll post that on the website?
Yeah, that's fine. This is Steve. You can send to me and I can get them to Jackie, or you can send to both of us.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'll do that. Now, question about offensive terms and terminology. And I mean, we all none of us want to offend anybody, but sometimes not knowing what's okay. So for instance, I've heard the term queer may be offensive in certain situations or to certain genders. Okay, so what I'm going to say is based on what I've heard from a lot of folks, but what's offensive to one person may not be offensive to another, and vice versa. The term queer, so I've used the term here, and it's simply because that is a term that some folks claim to identify themselves. There are some folks, especially older LGBT folks, that the term queer was so often used as an insult for them growing up, and was and so they have a really negative response to that term, and they do not use the term queer. Younger folks in general tend to be more comfortable with that. There may be exceptions. It's sort of like reclaiming a word that was used as an offensive term. And so queer can be. That same thing has happened, like there are some lesbians, I'm going to use this term that some people find offensive and some do not, the term dyke. That for a long time was used as an insult directed at lesbians, and usually with other profanity before that word. And in fact, I've had people yell that at me. But for me, when I was growing up in the lesbian world, I heard other lesbians using that term as almost a term of endearment. And so when a group of guys drove by in their car, and I was out with my friend, you know, trying out some new softball bats, and they yelled, dyke, at me, it didn't hurt because that we had already reclaimed that word. So the terminology can be iffy, and you know, checking in with folks about what's okay, that can be an interesting conversation. Yeah, I see somebody put that smear the queer game in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, that's exactly why queer is not comfortable for some folks. Let's see, guidance on how to talk to an employer whose own personal culture has problems with accepting these items. So employers can have a lot of problems with a lot of different things. They can have, they can be strongly embedded in one political party and have a problem with the other political party. They can have problems with folks that are living together and not married. They can have problems with lots of things, but it's about, this is a professional setting, and how are you going to recruit the best staff to do the best jobs? And they also need to be aware of the anti-discrimination laws, Title VII. So if they want to operate their business within the law, then they need to find their own way to grapple with that. And you can address that saying, I understand there are a lot of different feelings about lots of different issues. And I don't know how you've navigated you know, areas that you're feeling uncomfortable with some of your employees and how they're living their lives and choices they're making. And, you know, so I would encourage you to, you know, keep grappling with those issues and, understand the employment law that you have to work within. And then it's up to them to grapple with that. And it's possible that they may choose to discriminate. And then it's up to your client to decide how they want to respond to that. At least now they have some legal standing. Okay, now I know we have not gotten to all of the questions, but we are at time. So, oh man, I wish I could get to his nails were dirty underneath it now. Advising somebody on nail polish. I mean, that's just about professional appearance, and you can have those conversations, and then he or she need to make their decisions on how they want to do that. So I guess we need to wrap up for today because we are at time. I am available. You can follow up with me, shoot me an email or call me, and we can talk about any other further questions. I'll put together that list of youth groups and send to Jackie and Steve. Anything else, Steve and Jackie?
I just wanted to add that I did post in the chat feed the files, the PowerPoint in PDF format, as well as the other materials that were sent, are all attached in the group chat. You can download them. Plus, they will be on the IIDC website as well as the VR SharePoint site. Dean, I want to thank you so much. I wish we had 3 hours to share because this is a really important topic. And so we will get to your questions. If you want to continue to put questions in the chat feed, we'll leave the room open for a few minutes for you to do that. Thank you very much, Jean.